Well, I think, comrades, the title of the meeting is on the question of lessons for Latin America for the new left in Europe. And I think if we look at the situation globally, we see an entirely new era has opened up from the point of view of capitalism. And it's against that background that I think there are important lessons that we need to draw out from what has taken place in Latin America, because in a sense it was ahead of the broad cycle internationally. If you go back to the beginning of this century, we saw the coming to power of a whole series of left, as they termed it at the time, new left governments. It was socialism in the 21st century. We had Chavez coming to power in Venezuela. We had, of course, Morales in Bolivia. Later on, we had, in a different form, we had Lula coming to power, heading the Workers' Party government in Brazil. We had, of course, Correa in Ecuador. And it was a dramatic swing to the left throughout the whole of the continent. And that really was an advance. It was in contradiction to what was happening elsewhere, in Europe in particular, at that particular stage. And yet, if we look at what happened, despite even the most left and combative of those regimes and governments, which was really seen in Venezuela with the coming to power of the Chavez government, they were pushed through a whole series of measures in an extremely left direction in relation to what we've seen since the collapse of the former Stalinist states in 1989-92. For the first time in Venezuela, it was echoed a little bit in Bolivia, and also in Ecuador. They were compelled, on the basis of the mass pressure from below, to take quite serious blows, or strike quite serious blows against the interests of capitalism. You saw some nationalizations, significant reforms were brought into power. You see enraged the ruling class in all of those countries, the reforms that they took. In 2002, there was the attempted military coup against Chavez, which provoked a mass revolutionary upsurge, compelling Chavez to go further to the left. At that stage, he was even invoking some quotes from Trotsky and talking about opening up a new wave of socialism. He spoke about the need to build a new Fifth International, was what he put on the order of the day verbally at that particular stage. And yet, with all of those governments, what you saw was really one critical defect. They struck blows against capitalism. They were able to carry out significant reforms in the interests of the working class of those countries, particularly in Venezuela, because of the oil bonanza that they had. And it was quite dramatic and incredible what reforms were carried through. But they never took the decisive steps of breaking with capitalism itself. And that is the crucial point. And it's from that point of view, really you could say, is the most fundamental lesson for the new left, of a potential Corbyn government here in Britain, for the potential of a new, maybe Podemos-led government in Spain, or other new left formations coming to power. Won't take exactly the same form, but what we see now break in Latin America is an enormous warning, an alarm bell for the working class internationally. Because not only were the reforms transformed into counter-reforms, because what you then saw was a whole series of measures taken by the ruling class and by imperialism, of economic sabotage, of boycotts, strike of capital was taking place by the imperialist powers, the US imperialism in particular, but also then of course by the capitalist class in those countries. But then that came together with a dramatic change in the economic situation in all of those countries. The price of oil collapsed in Venezuela in particular. And that, combined with the sabotage, has resulted in a whole economic disaster unfolding. And this is where I think we have crucial lessons from the point of view of the left here in Europe, and the dangers that will face new left governments when they come to power. The ruling classes in Venezuela tried to strike on a number of times. Let us remember, in Bolivia, it came to the point almost a civil war. They were trying to eject the Morales government from power. And it was almost a civil war, literally, from the point of view of the masses taking up arms against the far right. But then, in case after case, including with Chavez and particularly with Morales, they tried to opt for this position of buying peace or arriving at social peace, negotiating with capitalism to prevent a break from capitalism itself, and had this idea, they proclaimed it as a new version of socialism, socialism in the 21st century. In essence, it was not fundamentally different to the ideas which had been put forward before. And in some ways, it didn't go as far as some of the old left reformist policies of the past. The nationalisations they carried through were not even full nationalisations. Usually it was mixed ownership of the economy, of maybe the state taking 60–70%, etc. It wasn't even wholesale nationalisations that we've seen in Europe in the previous period, and we've seen previously in Latin America under the Allende government in 70 to 73, which nationalised something like 60% of the economy. Even the left populist government of Cardenas in Mexico in the 1930s had nationalised the oil sector industry, which was a major blow at the time against the interests of US imperialism. So the ruling class then, from that point of view, have used the position to sabotage and undermine these governments. And as is always the case with a policy of reform, what does it do? A policy of reform, because it ends up, despite having a period of illusion and concessions, you end up at a certain stage that it neither satisfies, it enrages the ruling class, who don't like any measures being struck against them, but it doesn't satisfy the demands and the interests of the masses and the working class either. And without putting it into a blunter fashion, what we've seen in reality is that betrayal is always inherent in reformism, and through that, the price for that betrayal is paid by the working class. And that really brings us to the situation we're facing today, because the price for the failure to break from capitalism in all of these countries is now being paid in the most horrendous position in every one of these countries. We don't have time in the course of this introduction to go into it in detail, but there is a devastating social catastrophe and collapse in Venezuela. You see it in a whole series of ways, of a government which is of course now led by Maduro, which is riddled with corruption, is abandoned any pretense of carrying out social reforms. It's in conflict with the right, it is true, but it is riddled with corruption, its own defending its own particular economic interests, and you see such a devastating collapse. In reality, what we're faced with is the position almost of an element of a failed state, as a society is just collapsing in Venezuelan society. It's not just the propaganda of the right in terms of what is taking place. A return of hunger, the starvation, of desperation, facing whole sections of the working class and indeed the middle class, is reflected in this incredible exodus, which for Latin America is new. This mass migration of millions out of the country, fleeing into Colombia, going over the border into Brazil, where it's had devastating consequences as well. That is a new phenomenon in reality. I mean, you've had the migration, it's true, from Mexico and Central America up to the United States, but not from this point of view of the flooding out of refugees, which is what they are, facing a desperate position, including, by the way, some of our comrades in Venezuela who had to flee to Brazil because of the economic and social and political situation. A devastating situation. You see in a different way the same crisis, I don't have time to go into it, but now reflected in Nicaragua, where it's been a similar process. And in both cases, these governments that have come to power on the basis of a mass movement by the working class and the population, having taken some measures against capitalism, have then become imprisoned by capitalism, and now in the case of Venezuela and in the case of Nicaragua, it's almost gone full circle. Governments come to power as radical, reforming left governments have ended up now assuming the same characteristics of the previous regimes that they overthrow, in terms of corruption, in terms of defence of the system, and we have to say in terms of Nicaragua and an element of it in Venezuela, in terms of brutal repression against the masses as well. And that is, I think, a crucial lesson. And the price is paid by the working class, and it can also be paid by the working class internationally. Because now you have such a devastating failure in Venezuela, where it was put up only a few years ago, together with Cuba, but particularly Venezuela. This is the example of you know, a new form of socialism. This is the alternative to capitalism, and now the failure of that position is being used as a club to beat the whole of the left and the working class internationally. It features a little bit in terms of the last election here in Britain when they used it against Corbyn. It featured a lot in the Spanish state elections as it's being used against the left. And it has been taken by Bolsonaro in Brazil, and it has been used mercilessly to batter the left in Brazil. You want Caracas in Brazil, you vote for the PT. You know, and that's what's going to be played in London as well. If you want Corbyn, you're going to turn London into a Caracas with everything that goes with it. And you pay a price from that point of view. And we see that also now in terms of the position in Brazil. The PT and the Lula government was somewhat different. It wasn't of the same characteristic of as the Chavez government. It had a much more partly neoliberal, but it was more of a sort of a progressive centre-left type of government. But it came to power against the background of an economic boom, which was phenomenal in terms of what it meant. They were, even despite the limitations of the PT government, they were able to take millions from the favelas, the poorest section, and put them into of the youth, and put them into universities. The whole of the propaganda, and it's against the background of an economic growth. Brazil is now going to join the first world. That's where we're at. We're on the brink. It was used as part of the BRICS internationally, the great salvation for global capitalism of Brazil, Russia, India and China. Brazil was in that list, and it had a certain benefit. Living standards rose, a section was taken out of poverty, and the position developed. And Lula had a mass base, and it was an economic factors based on that. But they were the PT, as with the socialist parties in Europe, was increasingly bought into the parameters of capitalism, saw its parameters of capitalism, despite the rising living standards, also carried out attacks against the working class, introduced a vicious pension reform, which triggered a split from the PT and the formation of PSOL. That took place under the PT government, and it was riddled with the corruption of that. There is no doubt. Lula then inevitably gave way to Dilma, but then you saw the inevitable situation develop, a fundamental change in the economic situation, and it's produced the worst economic crisis in Brazil probably for 100 years in terms of the scale of the collapse. And you've had the working class faced with the position where a few years ago they were promised they're going to join the position of the European working class in terms of their wages. And by the way, it produced a massive strike wave, because the propaganda of the ruling class was, well, we're on the brink of joining the first world. Well, the conclusions of the workers at the time, well, if we're joining the first world, we want first world wages. And it did produce a whole series of wage battles at that particular stage, and workers forced concession. But now we're faced with this economic catastrophe, and it's the worst recession for 100 years. And the social consequences of that have been devastating. You have in Brazil an element of Venezuela in terms of a social collapse. It's reflected in a mass rise of unemployment amongst all sectors of the population. But it's reflected also with a social disintegration. And this is one of the main weapons that was used by Bolsonaro during the course of the election campaign. 70,000 people killed in urban violence in the course of 12 months. And that was a crucial weapon that he used, a desperate position which is opening up, reflecting the poverty, the social collapse, the organised criminal gangs which exist, the drug cartels which are present in São Paulo and Rio. And I don't know if comrades have travelled to Brazil, but it is stunning when you see these organisations, not just a few gangsters selling drugs on the streets. You are dealing with organised military machines. They have a command structure There's one organisation called the First Command of the Capital, which is mainly based in Sao Paulo. There's another one in Rio called Red Hand, and years ago I saw the areas that they were involved in. All of them, by the way, had their origins in left-wing Maoist guerrilla organisations who've disintegrated, but they have a structure. They even call it a central committee. They have an organised army in terms of the position of their drug dealers at different levels. You're dealing with a machine in terms of the position, but it's been like a cancer how it's crept into the poorest and most downtrodden sections of the population. And with the drug cartels especially, you've had this brutal social collapse and killing. 70,000 people more in the killing fields of Brazil than what we've seen in certain areas of Syria during the course of the war itself. Now that has been used by Bolsonaro. You've had this collapse, a desperate position, a complete loss of trust and confidence in the leadership of the PT. The ruling class tried to remove Dilma from power through a parliamentary coup because they wanted her out, because despite the fact she was more right-wing in a sense than Lula, but more the government itself had moved to the right. They weren't confident in it. The Brazilian ruling class wanted the PT out of power because they wanted the male fist to carry through a more brutal neoliberal policy of privatisation. That's what they attempted. They then ended up with Temer, who took over from her through this position of an attempt, well, not an attempted, a successful parliamentary coup against Dilma. When it was unbelievable hypocrisy, they were denouncing the PT for corruption, which of course was true, but the corruption involving Lula didn't really involve Dilma. She was never really touched by it personally, but nevertheless the PT leaders were embezzling millions from the different state coffers, but it was absolutely nothing compared to what every other political party was involved in and every other section of the Brazilian ruling class was involved in, as was exposed during the Operation Car Wash, they called it. But here in Brazil, the right has scored a major victory, and it represents a turning point. It is going to open up an entirely new chapter, and it's full of dangers. Will it be a military dictatorship? This has been the main issue of debate and discussion of the which is now unfolding on the Brazilian left. Is it going to mean a fascist type of regime will come to power? Now, I don't think it would be true to say that it's going to be a repetition of going back to the military dictatorships of the 1970s and 80s that took place in the whole of Latin America, in the sense of the scale of the brutality or the length of time that this government would necessarily last in power. Pinochet in Chile lasted decades in terms of the time that he was in power. That position is not there. It is not either a cold, calculated seizure of power by the military. But, having said that, we have to recognise what it is. It is going to be an extremely authoritarian and repressive government with a fig leaf of parliamentary democracy around it. And we should remember, for the comrades who followed the events in Latin America, in Peru, Fujimori was also a parliamentary democracy formerly, but it was absolutely brutal in terms of the executions and the death squads that were unleashed in that. And that type of scenario in different states of Brazil can open up. The government itself will move to carry out repressive measures. We already have in Rio, the new governor has changed the laws so that it's virtually impossible now to take any legal action against a policeman who pulls a pistol and shoots anybody dead on the streets. And there's been many cases in Rio where the police have pulled pistols. They've seen a young, usually a young black kid with a mobile phone in his hand, and they've used that as an excuse that they thought it was a gun, and then he's just been executed. That'll be virtually legalised in reality. What you're going to have in Rio, in effect, is a version, probably because of the hard line, and you have a militarisation of Rio already, and it was chilling. I don't know if the comrades saw the video for those workers in Latin America who saw in Rio, after Bolsonaro's victory, the way the military came onto the streets, and the military trucks and the military tanks. It was a chilling reminder of what had gone there before, and that sent and has sent a chill down the spine of those who can remember what it was like in Latin America in the 70s. And it will be brutal. There'll be an element here at the Philippines of what the Duterte regime has carried out, and they used the position of cracking down on the violence. That will be their excuse that they use, and there'll be other elements. You already have the position. That's the formal position. What the government formally does is maybe a bit more open, but what this will do is unleash the local dogs of war, who are not under the direct control necessarily of the government, of fascistic gangs, of groups within the police and the different state machines, who will feel they have a free hand to now take measures. You saw it with Bolsonaro himself, of how they're preparing to use this. Bolos, who was the presidential candidate of PSOL, and the MTST, the urban homeless movement. Bolsonaro has pronounced that they are now regarded as a terrorist organisation. Bolos may be move towards arresting at a certain stage. We don't know how that will go. Already, we speak to our comrades. Of course, they featured young blacks. Attacks on the gay and lesbian community have now started already on the streets. People who are evidently more openly gay in some of the big cities even have been beaten up by fascists. There's an enormous polarisation which has taken place, but it is not all one-sided. You've already had big demonstrations against it, and one of the features in this new scenario is that this government will probably quite rapidly be a government of crisis. There are different contending forces within this government. It will go into all sorts of splits and divisions. Bolsonaro's economic policy, previously his position was, it was not pro-neoliberal, and there's a point there that we have to bear in mind. It's not the whole story at all, but the Brazilian military from which he comes from is not the same as the Chilean military. In Chile, the military went wholesale over to support neoliberal policy. The tradition of the Brazilian military has been to support a policy of state intervention, of Brazilian nationalism, and more defensive state position. Bolsonaro reflected that at one stage. Now he's switched under the pressure of the ruling class to support more policies, but he has the military in the government. There will be contending struggles that will open up between the different factors. He will have to go into a coalition. There are 30 parties in the Brazilian Congress. I mean, you have a whole series of local fiefdoms, of state interests, of landlords, of feudal landowners, etc., all of whom have their own contending position. All sorts of divisions will open up within this regime, as you see it already. You've already seen, while Bolsonaro says the MTST should be regarded as a terrorist organisation, his new Ministry of Justice, who was by the name of Soije Maro, who was the head judge who carried through the Operation Car Wash investigations. He's not a friend of the working class, by the way, because he also ruled in favour of Lula going to prison. But he said, no, it's not true. Bolos and the MTST are not going to be declared as terrorist organisations. He may be a bit more open, you know, to represent a bit more of a more intelligent policy to defend the interests of the ruling class. On the other side, the new Minister of the Economy, who they will appoint, Paulo Guedes, is a vicious pro-neoliberal individual. His position is there should be 100% privatisation of everything. That's what he stands for openly. And that's what he will try and drive. But there'll be all sorts of interest. But the key question that will be posed here is how the struggle develops again against this government. Because it will be repression they'll base themselves on. It will intimidate a layer. On the other side, they're going to come forward with these attacks on the working class. The pension reforms under Temer was defeated in the Brazilian Congress. They've now re-announced they're going to bring it back in. straight away. That can trigger a movement against sections of the working class and the youth, and other similar attacks can do it. We've seen the coming together of different forces. It will pose all sorts of very important tactics for our comrades, as I'm sure Andre will explain, of what we advocate in this position. We're part of a front, not just in PSOL. There's the a front which exists, the People Without Fear, which is a very important organisation. It has within it PSOL, it has within it sections of the Communist Party, the Trade Union Federation, the CUT, and social movements are involved in that. We would advocate a united front, including with social sections and the rank and file base of the Workers' Party, which still has a certain base, a big important base amongst particularly older sections of the working class. We're in favour of having a united front, even with Lula, against some of the repressive measures, but not a political pact with the Lula government, because we have to bring forward in this position the people that are responsible for this catastrophe opening up has been precisely the policies that were introduced by the PT, and we cannot remain silent on that question despite the threat. We can have a bloc, even with Lula, demanding his release, against all repression, against the attacks against all, joint demonstrations we can have, and we will support that, but not a political pact defending the political programme that the PT leadership put forward. And we have to struggle within this for the building of a new socialist alternative and opposition, probably around PSOL. It is not clear though how that will develop. We have a national meeting this weekend actually at the PSOL National Directorate in Brasilia, where Comrade Andre and other comrades are currently present. It is not clear what Bolos, who was the PSOL candidate, is going to do. If they're going to stay in this bloc with PSOL and other social forces, or what. They may move to try and accommodate, under the pressure for unity, to the PT leadership. He recently has visited Lula in prison, not necessarily a wrong thing in and of itself to do, but what is the political agreement that he's negotiating with Lula is a key point, and we have to see how that position opens up and develops. But it's going to be a training ground, this, for a new generation, because in this position in Latin America it had as a very brutal history of struggle. But inevitably, because of what happened with the end of the dictatorships, the economic boom, for the new generation, they are not prepared for this degree of struggle. I was in Brazil earlier this year. It's true, in Brazil, in the rural areas, I visited the state Goiás, which is a very rural area, where you still have feudalism, by the way. You still have slavery there. We have marvellous comrades there conducting a very heroic struggle. These sort of executions that we saw at Marielle in Rio really have always been the case in these rural outlaw states. They've not gone away. But it's not been the case for a whole generation in the big urban areas. It was seen as something different. This has been a shock for the new youth. And they're not really prepared for this. They can be hardened and battled, but it's going to be a bloody struggle. These forces are not going to just step down on the basis of an academic debate. The forces that are involved there. It poses the question of mobilisations of building a social base. It means we have to come forward, as our comrades are doing, with raising the question of building genuine committees of self-defence of workers, of the youth in the favelas, etc., to deal with this position, protection of meetings, etc., and be prepared for a real struggle to unfold. And that undoubtedly can develop in the course of the next period. Now, very briefly, comrades, I don't have time. This is a key scenario for Brazil, but it is a point here, as Sharma commented on the rally. This is a big blow. Does it represent a major swing to the right? Well, that's a bit more complicated in terms of it, because even within Bolsonaro's victory, if you look at the opinion polls, the clear majority are still against privatisation. They're against the attacks that are taking place in cuts, etc., and broadly are defended a more radically left position. But this government, it may take longer, but we should also take heart from what has happened in other countries of Latin America. You saw the coming to power in Argentina of Macri a vicious neoliberal right-wing government, again reflecting this wave. But nevertheless, in a very short space of time, I think it was about a year or so since the government came to power, their neoliberal policies have provoked 3 general strikes against the attacks of the Macri government. Argentina is now on the brink and plunging into another economic debt crisis and will provoke big social explosions. You've seen the emergence of some Trotskyist forces which have sustained quite an important base in that position. It's a measure that even these right governments can provoke a backlash, and that will be the case in Brazil. However, in Brazil it's going to be a bit more of a protracted process, and it will be a battle in terms of that position. But it's not the whole picture in terms of the position. We have a major point, I don't have time to develop it, but a major point of departure for the continent is what has happened in Mexico, which is a decisive issue. The coming to power of AMLO, which represents an historic break with the past in the different regimes that you've had in Mexico. It was a blow, in a sense, against the ruling class of Mexico, despite the fact that he's tried to accommodate himself with capitalism. That's been the trajectory that it's been on. But what we have to be cognizant is it's not going to be a stable position. Already that's triggered marvellous movements of the youth because of the expectations which have been raised in the massive University of UNAM in Mexico City and other areas as well. Him coming to power is going to unleash massive expectations despite his attempts to move to the right, and it's going to open up an entirely new chapter of struggle within Mexican society, which is crucial both for Latin America but also for the United States for obvious reasons. Where he goes, AMLO, is unclear. He may just capitulate and go to the rest. But we have to remember Mexican tradition here is a country of tradition of revolution in very confused form, but that tradition is there. And even AMLO, despite being moved to the left now, against the background of a major economic recession, both in Mexico, the United States, in a global position, with the social upheavals that that can provoke, even he can be propelled back in a more radical direction. Let us not forget it was Cardenas who gave Trotsky exile, by the way, and he wasn't a revolutionary socialist, Trotsky was, but Cardenas was at that time. But they were compelled, the Cardenas government was compelled to nationalise and strike a blow against the interests of imperialism. So, comrades, there are many aspects of this discussion, but it is rich with lessons for the future and a warning to the left. It won't take the same form as in Latin America. Europe, in that sense, of course, is very different to Latin America. But the failure of the left and what it has opened up is a stark warning for us here in Europe and other countries. And there is a point that I would just conclude on. This is an indication of the new era of capitalism. We have the position of Bolsonaro in Brazil, an extreme case. You have the position of Trump in the United States. You can have that scenario. You have the FPO in Austria. You've seen the growth of the right. Now, we have to draw a balanced conclusion from that. But one thing we have to be clearly conscious of. This is the new norm of what capitalist society means. It will come in different forms, ebbs and flows in terms of their strength, but the idea of going back to a peaceful position, of a little tete-a-tete between the left and the right, that is gone in terms of the position. And to build a new left, it has to be a combative left that sinks powerful roots amongst the working class. And unfortunately, in Brazil, PSOL, while it is very significant and very important, and it's a potential force to develop, has not yet sunk those deep social roots amongst the working class. It has not gone into the favelas in general in the way that the PT did in its period when it was initially formed, and that has to be done. And it requires the hardening and building of a hardened, more combative position. But this is a new era of capitalism that is opened up. It's going to be a semi-permanent feature, these far-right populist positions, until the working class comes forward and is able to decisively put its stamp on the political situation in terms of struggle and in terms of building a viable alternative. Through these defeats, victories can come and they can pave the way through the development of a new generation which has drawn all of the lessons necessary. But I think, comrades, those are some of the most important lessons that we have to draw from this process in Latin America for Europe, which is a pointer to what is necessary in terms of building new mass socialist forces that are going to be able to challenge capitalism in the course of the next period.